now I guess this again is the sort of the meaty part of the topic. This is where we get to go into a lot of detail with the human immune system, but I just want to make sure that we are not overwhelmed by it. I will be going through this very slowly because I know sometimes I have a habit of talking fast, so I'll be slowly stepping us through this, so trust me. And of course, please ask questions as we go. Clarify anything that you have to. No question is a silly question. Something that is super important to always remember. No question is a silly question. So let's have a look. Firstly, we are looking at how does the body, that's our practice question, how does the human immune system respond to exposure to a pathogen? So there are mechanisms in our body that are in place to respond to pathogens. The first line of defense is part of the innate immunity. The innate immunity essentially has the first line of defense and the second line of defense, and it is non-specific, so it's non-specific to different pathogens. So it doesn't discriminate between I'm only going to work if it's a virus, or it doesn't discriminate between the transmission of the disease. So it's non-specific, and it is non-specific, and it's fast as well. So the first line of defense includes specifically these physical barriers, which are trying to stop the pathogen from getting in. We've got cilia, which are hair-like projections that line our airways, and they move in a wave-like motion to push pathogens away from the lung. So here, as you can see here, this is an example of cilia. And what they're doing is, because they're moving in a wave-like motion, they're trying to push the pathogens away from the lung, and a lot of the time the pathogens get stuck in the cilia, so they don't go through to the lung. The second one that we are looking at is mucous membranes. So mucous membranes line openings, cells lining the openings of the body, they secrete mucus, and that mucus traps the pathogens and particles. So this is again important in ensuring that the pathogen doesn't get past, it doesn't get through to your lungs. So we've got that in our noses, for example. So it's about ensuring that it does not get, so that particles that we breathe in don't make it to the lungs. Then we've got chemical barriers. So these chemical barriers include, for example, stomach acid. Stomach acid is very strong, very acidic in our guts, and it is all about ensuring, not in our guts, sorry, works obviously in that region with them, but stomach acid is super important in ensuring that any harmful bacteria, like, they don't survive those conditions, because it is so acidic. There are also alkali contents of the small intestine and enzymes in our mouths that, again, if we breathe in any bacteria or any pathogens, they ensure that, again, they're very best to make sure that those pathogens don't travel down to our important organs like lungs and start infecting them. We then have secretions. So these are fluids which are secreted from the body, including sweat glands, hair follicles, and urine. So fluids secreted from these specific parts of sweat glands, hair follicles, and urinary tract. And what they do is they aim to flush out pathogens, and they're also antimicrobial. Last but not least, the skin. The skin itself is a protective layer. If you've sort of had a chance to go learn a bit about skin, you'd notice that the skin that we have right now, it's a protective layer. What we have underneath this part is what is called the true skin, and that's the epidermis. That's the actual skin. This is basically a protective layer for us, and it secretes, so the pores in our skin secretes antimicrobials, and the outer layer of skin is constantly shedding as well. And that is, again, so that we are getting rid of any pathogens that are on there, and obviously our cells need to grow. So the first barrier is the skin, the second barrier is the cilia, then we've got chemical barriers, and so on. So these two are related, I guess. So we've got cilia and mucous membranes, chemical barriers and secretions, and the first one is the skin. So that's the main one. Then we've got cilia, then we've got chemical barriers. So it's in the form where, you know, this is like at the very beginning the pathogen will encounter. If it makes past the skin, it's going to encounter the cilia, and if it makes past the cilia, it's going to encounter the chemical barriers in the body. Okay, so we now look at basically the first line of defense in a nutshell is that we've got the body's mechanical barriers. Here's a pathogen trying to get in, let me in, but it's finding it hard. But obviously we know that they do tend to make it in sometimes, but most of the times the mechanical barriers do a pretty good job of protecting the body. The second line of defense is also part of the innate immunity, and the second line of defense is it includes 4 specific things. It includes the lymph system. Firstly, so the lymph system produces the white blood cells, and these white blood cells are crucial for majority of the immune response, and they're basically networks of tissue, and there are networks of tissues and organs which help to rid the body of toxins. So we've got cervical lymph nodes, thoracic duct, the thymus right there, the spleen, the pelvic lymph nodes. So all of these tissues and organs that are working together to flush out toxins and waste from the body. Secondly, we've got inflammation. So inflammation is basically swelling. So when there is the dilation of blood vessels and infiltration of inflammatory cells at the site of infection, and that causes heat, pain, redness, swelling, and acute loss of function. So there are 5 cardinal signs of inflammation: pain, heat, redness, swelling, and loss of function. That's the last one. And that generally doesn't happen. It's usually sort of this, depending on obviously what the injury is. Okay, we then have the second line of defense, which is, the third part of the second line of defense, which first is phagocytosis. So this is definitely a term you want to remember, phagocytosis. So phagocytosis involves special white blood cells, including macrophages and neutrophils. And what they do is, what phagocytosis includes is, these specific white blood cells change their shape to engulf a pathogen. They basically eat up a pathogen. And they do this, and then they destroy them using acid, and lysosomes play a huge role in this process, because lysosomes, as you would know, generally are responsible for the waste and disposal. So they play a huge role in actually. Firstly, we've got from here. So what we see is that the special white blood cells here, for example, a macrophage, goes ahead, it captures the pathogen right there. From there, it takes the pathogen into the body, and then we see these lysosomes come across, and they come through, and they use acid to destroy the pathogen, and through that the pathogen is destroyed, and then it is dispersed from the cell right there. So that's phagocytosis. Then we've got cell death to seal off pathogens, and this is known as apoptosis. So this involves the cells, which are this time macrophages and lymphocytes, lymphocytes, which completely surround the pathogen, and then they die. So they form a cyst, and that cyst is filled with pus, and through that they block pathogen movement and also block the nutrient supply to the pathogen, which is obviously helping the pathogen, and that causes it to die. So as you can see here, so normal, that is a regular cell, but now it's condensing. So they're basically once they've got their pathogen over here, they're basically completely, they've surrounded it, and it is filled with pus, it's forming a cyst, and through that it is killed, and it leaves these fragments here. So this is apoptosis right there. So now we've gone through 2 very important ideas, the first and the second line of defense, and both of them are part of the innate immunity. With that, we will now look at adaptive immunity, but an adaptive immunity is basically the immune response. The first two, obviously the immune system plays a role, but we don't actually see the key players of immune system in innate immunity. They come through in adaptive immunity. So if you were to compare with innate immunity, firstly, innate immunity is always there. Your body, those mechanical barriers, they're always there. They're not, sort of phasing in and out. They're always there. And it includes this first and second line of defense. Specificity is that it is non-specific, so it's not specific to a disease. For example, your cilia is not only going to move when it sees a specific disease, it's non-specific, and it aims to stop any disease from coming into your body. The response rate is rapid. This happens quite rapidly. Phagocytosis, apoptosis, these processes are happening rapidly. Is there immunological memory? So for example, do those cells remember, okay, this is how we have, for instance, killed these cells? No. So that means that it does not have immunological memory. And so the keywords here are always to remember innate, right? So it's innate, it is constant, it is non-specific, there's a rapid response, and most importantly, there's no immunological memory. Adaptive immunity, on the other hand, now is something that arises when the pathogen enters the body. Once the pathogen has gained entry into the body and it is not being stopped earlier on and killed, for example. So for example, in innate immunity, if it was sort of stopped in the cilia or something, or if it was stopped, let's say in the stomach acid, actually not stopped there, but it was in that region specifically, the macrophages may come and induce phagocytosis and finish off the bacteria, but that would mean that it has gained entry into the body, basically. So now adaptive immunity comes into play when the pathogen has gained entry into the body. And there are two main elements that you're always going to remember with this. Those are B cells and T cells. So B for bat, T for toy. So B cells and T cells. And this response, and these cells specifically, are highly specific. This response is specific. It is tailored to the pathogen that enters the body. So it's going to be very specific to that pathogen, because every pathogen is of course different and needs to be dealt with differently, and that is what the adaptive immunity does. The response rate is that primary exposure is slow. The first time that a pathogen enters your body, the response is going to be slow, and I'm going to explain in 1 second why that is. However, the second time that pathogen enters the body, the response is going to be a lot faster, and that is because the adaptive immunity has immunological memory. The B cells and T cells actually remember how they dealt with a specific pathogen. And so our keywords here are that it's adaptive, it is highly specific, it has immunological memory. Okay, so now we come to the really important part, which is the third line of defense. Like I said, there are two main cells that are involved. There are the B cells and the T cells. The B cells are involved in what we call the antibody-mediated immunity. So I would definitely jot this down. The B cells are involved in the antibody-mediated immunity, and that is also known as humoral immunity. So humor and then AL, humoral immunity. And what happens is we've got two types of B cells. So B cells differentiate into two types of cells. They differentiate into either plasma cells, which provide immediate protection. It secretes loads of antibodies, and it has same specificity as the parent cell. What does that mean? So let me just take one step back. When a cell, every cell has antigens on it. Antigens, and especially the antigens is basically, these sort of these signs on the surface of the cell, these little like receptors on the surface of the cell that tells the body that either these cells are foreign, so if you've got a pathogen, the body will recognize its antigens on the cell surface and go, oh, that's not from our body, that is from somewhere else. But the other cells in our bodies would have antigens that the body recognizes as self, right? Okay, this is my cell, I don't have to attack it. The immune system goes, I don't have to attack it because it is my cell. But in some cases, you know, if you would have heard about autoimmunological diseases, and that happens because the body is not able to recognize its own cells as like self cells, and that is why they attack those cells. So that happens with, for example, with type 1 diabetes with insulin cells, or the cells that produce insulin. But anyways, let's take one step back again. So what are antigens? Antigens are receptors on the surface of a cell that allow the body to recognize foreign cells versus self cells. So cells that are from your own body. That is the key here. So for those antigens that are not from your own body, your body, and specifically these plasma B cells, produce antibodies. And what those antibodies do is those antibodies go and bind to the antigen. And that is basically a way of flagging to the rest of the important cells, hey, I found this specific pathogen in the body. I've recognized that you know, it has different antigens. We've recognized that, and now we've made an antibody to it. So far, just keep that in mind. So the key words here are antigens and antibodies. So plasma cell provides immediate protection and secretes loads of antibodies to provide that immediate protection. We will talk about, you know, that's not the whole process, it's a simplified process. We will go into it, but just for now, bear with me. So that's plasma cells. The second type of cell that the B cells differentiate into is memory B cells. Memory B cells, these are the cells that remember what the antibody produced was to that specific antigen. So these cells remember, you know, that, oh, this is the antigen and I have produced this antibody to it, so I need to remember. These cells do that remembering. And so the next time, if you get that same pathogen, if it comes back, these are the cells that are going to go, oh, I already have the antibody for it, let me go deal with it. Which is why that secondary exposure to a pathogen is faster, because we already have the antibodies ready to go. So that's that. They also remain, like I said, they remain in circulation to allow for a quicker and stronger response upon reinfection. So that's the B cells. They are responsible for humoral. Let me write it down. Oh, I cannot write like that. Please excuse my handwriting. So these are humoral. Okay, there we go. Sorry, that took a lot of concentration. So yeah, so B cells are responsible for antibody-mediated immunity or humoral immunity. That is the role of the B cells. Now let us look at the T cells. I'm trying to draw like a line in between here. Okay, cool. So the T cells are responsible for cell-mediated immunity. I'm going to go through a schematic of what happens in each, but just give me 1 second. I promise we'll get through it. But first, you need to know what these players are. So with B cells, there are 2 main players. B cells differentiate into plasma cells and memory B cells. T cells, they are responsible for cell-mediated immunity. And the way I like to remember these different types of T cells is to think of it like a friend group. Yep, so I like to think of it as a friend group. So we've got 4 types of friends. We have firstly the helper T cells. These helper T cells play a huge role in helping out the other white blood cells, including the B cells. And what they do is they secrete cytokines to help coordinate the immune response. So once they latch on to the pathogen, they secrete cytokines to then go ahead and like tell everyone, hey, there's a pathogen here, I found it, come along, we need to, you know, do the whole immune response. So I like to remember the helper T cells as like the kind, helpful friend in the group. That's like really sweet. That's how I like to think of the helper T cells. So that's the helper T cells. Then we've got the cytotoxic killer T cells. I love the name. I think it's such a strong name. And these are basically the cells that cause destruction. They release cytotoxins which kill target cells by triggering apoptosis. So they see a cell, they don't think, they go ahead and they kill. That is what these cells do. That's why they're destructive. And I like to remember the cytotoxic killer T cells as like the really, you know, the really angry friend of the group, the friend that's always like ready to go ahead and fight. I like to remember it as like that friend of the group, the cytotoxic killer T cells. It's a killer T cell. It's going to go ahead and cause destruction. Then we've got the suppressor T cell. What the suppressor T cell does, as you can see in the name, is that it controls the immune response by basically controlling and suppressing the activity of the other T cells. Most importantly, the cytotoxic killer T cell. It tells the cytotoxic killer T cell to suppress its activity. You know, like, mate, you can't go ahead and kill all the cells. And I like to think of the suppressor T cells as like the best friend to the cytotoxic killer T cells that always gives you that balance. Like, hey, you can't go overboard. You know, there are some cells in the body that are our own. So you just need to focus on just dealing with the pathogens and stop. Because basically cytotoxic killer T cells, they're destructive. And so the suppressor T cell is like the best friend that calms it down and just makes sure it doesn't, that the cytotoxic killer T cells don't do anything rash. Finally, we've got the memory T cells. These guys I like to think as the intellectual, like, awesome, smart kids of the group. These are the ones that are like, hey, you are all, you know, so busy in getting this whole response happening, but you forgot to actually remember what antibodies you used, how you actually went about, you know, doing this whole response. So the memory T cells give the immunological memory in the cell-mediated immunity, and they remain in circulation again to allow for quicker response next time that there's an infection. So that's our 4 main cells. Helper T cells, the kind, helpful ones in the group that are always ready to stand up for anyone. Cytotoxic killer T cells, the friend that is very hot-headed, ready to go, ready to like fight anytime. The suppressor T cells, the best friend of that hot-headed friend that go, no mate, you need to stop, that calm that friend down. And finally, the memory T cells, the smart kids, the quiet kids of the group that are like, you need to remember what this whole process was, let me do that for you. And this just helps me like really clearly remember it. So hopefully this helped you, but if you want to find another way to remember it, sure do. I mean, the names are quite easy to sort of remember too, like helper, cytotoxic, suppressor, memory. That works as well, but whatever works best for you there. So just remember, the 2 B cells are playing a huge role in the antibody-mediated immunity or humoral immunity, and the T cells play a big role in the cell-mediated immunity. I just like to remember B cells as antibody-mediated immunity, like they're responsible for the antibody-mediated immunity. Think about B cells and antibody, like that can help body and B cells. And that's how I remember that the opposite is the cell-mediated. So antibody-mediated is going to be humoral. The other one with the T cells is going to be cell-mediated. That is something that helps me remember it. Okay, so now let us actually have a look at what this whole process is, what is happening here. And to do that, what I might